Well, good evening, my fellow Reaganauts. I am Becky Norton Dunlop, had the privilege of serving in the Reagan administration, and my old boss, Ed Fulner, here brought me to Heritage a few years ago, where we now regularly celebrate the accomplishments of President Reagan and the principles for which he stood. Many of the ideas came from the Heritage Mandate for Leadership in 1979 and 1980. We're delighted to welcome you all here tonight. I love to look out and say I see familiar faces, and that's a compliment to all of us because we all look slightly different than we did when we were warring together in the 1980s. We have a great program for you tonight. We have so many Reaganauts who've written such wonderful books, and we always like to bring them to the attention of our fellow alums. So I'm going to, first of all, thank you for coming here to the Heritage Foundation and thank Heritage for allowing us to do this event here, and then turn this program over to Mr. Lou Cordia, who has been the Executive Director of the Reagan Alumni Association, which continues to roll on, add people, and hopefully will even add more people in the next 6 or 7 months. Mr. Cordia.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Mr. Meese and Ed Fulner for always opening up Heritage. And as I've said before, I view Heritage as the center of Reaganism. Looking back to 1980 with Mandate for Leadership, as Becky had mentioned, and everything that they've done since under Ed's leadership and now under Jim DeMint. So thank you very much, Heritage. All of you, not all of you, many of you have asked me about the directory. It will be in the mail shortly. You'll have it by the end of the month. We have about 3,800 members in it, which remains the largest President's Alumni Association of all. And so thank you for not only being a part, but letting us know how to reach our fellow alumni. So thank you. One of the things that we have done over the years is, as great books on President Reagan are written, we try to get them into your hands and let you know about them, and we're delighted to have two authors of two new Reagan books here with us tonight. But before I introduce them, I was asked tonight, do you have one of your jokes? And so I'll try it on you. It sounded like some of them weren't interested in that, but for the rest of you, three priests were fishing, and they're in a boat in the lake, not very successful. They've been out there for several hours. And so one of the priests says, I hear confessions, but I don't really give them. I'd like to confess that my major sin is that I take off my collar, I take some of the money from Sunday, and I'm a gambler, and I run over to the casino and spend a lot of that money. And the other priests are going, oh, that's just terrible. Second guy says, well, I take that money too, but I spend it on a prostitute. And they went, oh my God, that's just terrible. They look at the third one, he says, I don't want to say anything. They said, well, you've got to, we did. He said, you're not going to like what I'm about to say. And both of them said, well, I didn't like what he said. And he said, I don't like what he said. He said, well, my sin is I gossip, and I can't wait to get out of this boat. So, well, thank you again for coming. We have two great authors here tonight. I'll introduce the first and then come back and introduce the second. Our first is Sven Kraemer. As many of you know, Sven, over the years, he's a lifetime of scholarship and government service perspectives in his new book, Inside the Cold War from Marx to Reagan. In it, he documents, as no one actually has before, the ideologies, roots, history, strategies, and turning points of what he calls the Third World War that lasted over 140 years. Sven teaches new generations, and some of us, me included, about this history. He tells us what really shaped this conflict and how Reagan's new strategy won the war America and the free world democracies were losing to the totalitarians. Sven also brings us lessons about how Reagan's strategy of peace and freedom through strength helps us understand and defeat threats from today's militant faiths and forces linked to weapons of mass terror and destruction. He served President Reagan's Defense Transition Team and on the White House National Security Council. He's also a member of our association's Founders Club, which is a lifetime membership. And I thought I'd share with you an excerpt from a letter that President Reagan wrote him in 1987. Nothing is more important to me as assuring the security of the United States and the peace of the world. Arms reductions are an important tool to achieve that end. Our progress in this area these past 7 years is testimony to your tireless efforts, your integrity and hard-headed realism, and your broad vision. I appreciate all you have done, not only to shape policy, but help explain it to the American people and the world. All Americans are in your debt. Please welcome Sven.
Thank you very much, Lou. And all of us Reagan alumni owe you a lot in the initiative you took to found this association, because when we celebrate the birthday and life of Ronald Reagan, we're really celebrating one of the great presidents in our history. I personally rank him as a leader, a wartime leader with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Winston Churchill, which is quite unusual, and I wish we had somebody like that running right now for office. Because his vision, his life, his learning really blessed our country. And while he believed in divine providence very strongly, as I do, as being part of the American heritage, he never took it for granted that we would be bailed out of the slide that we were on in the 70s, and especially at the end of the first period of Jimmy Carter's term. And I think that one of the reasons he was such a fine president, and earlier such a fine governor, is that as an actor, as a broadcaster, he read a lot of scripts. He wrote a lot of scripts. He assumed a lot of perspectives. He had a very broad outlook, and he tolerated people with different opinions. And what he did was he sifted from his team around him the options that might work best against a totalitarian challenge. Because the United States internally and externally has, through much of its history, not had to face such radical challenges to our principles, our constitutional principles, our founding principles. And he understood it in part from that, and in part because I think his encounter with totalitarians in the Second World War, which most people don't seem to know much about, was that he went from a reserve officer in the Army in the 30s to an active duty officer. And what did he do? He made over 400 training films for people going into battle to die or to risk dying, and to learn how to do what? How to fight and win against totalitarians. We had the first of those was the Germans, and the second was the Japanese. Actually, Hitler declared war on the United States right after Pearl Harbor, when we had declared war on Japan. But he already knew about both of those countries. It's clear from things he said as president in terms of the challenge that we faced, which meant that we couldn't negotiate in normal terms with them. And then as president, he realized also very immediately, even as candidate, that we couldn't use the main weapon, physical weapon we had, the atomic bomb, again in the future very easily. So we had to fight the ideological combat battle in the Cold War. And we had to fight with all the instruments of statecraft that had been deteriorating for some years before. On the assumption, I believe they deteriorated, on the assumption that we didn't really need them and that traditional diplomacy and traditional fellowship and traditional trust in somehow values and visions accommodating to each other would work. When Marx wrote his manifesto in 1848, 100 years before the Truman Doctrine, and Truman fought in 1948 what was normally considered the beginning of the Cold War, he was already setting forth what became with Lenin the totalitarian doctrine of class warfare, humans being material, they had no soul, they were collective entities, and all owning and all planning state, violent revolutions, and global revolution after having gone through a socialist phase. And Marx and Lenin distinguished themselves from socialists. I don't think Bernie knows any of this history, but it's interesting to me that socialists, by and large, were democratic, and communists were anti-democratic. They were anti-humanitarian. They were anti-peaceful progress. And Marx considered those, and Lenin considered those who different with his treatment of violence and total planning and total ownership and total elimination of the family and abolition of religion and so on. Those were his principles, which Lenin applied. He said they were traitors to the cause. So I remind you that Lenin imposed this blueprint in 1917, not by overthrowing the Tsar, but by overthrowing the provisional Russian government that was a coalition and was led by social democrats, or a social democrat or democratic socialist, Kerensky. And just like when Castro came to power through a coalition, other guys eliminated. When Hitler came to power, he eliminated a coalition, and he came in he was elected. And the National Socialists of Hitler, his party in German was called the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the German National Socialist Workers' Party. National Socialist, a very proud phrase on the right and on the left. I believe, in my study of political philosophy and history, that the two are identical. It's in a circle. They overlap. The opposite pole is freedom. And the reason that I have not nuclear weapons on this cover of my book, or in fact any weapons, although I worked on arms control, I think this ideological weapon that was used against freedom and liberty and constitutional balance and inalienable rights is that liberty is what has made us, or freedom has made us, the greatest thing. This is the first object that I saw when I came from Germany, and I was born in England, but I was held in Germany by the Gestapo for 7 years of the Second World War. The first thing I saw in the United States was this. So I've always known I would write about it sometime. Actually, the word "I" does not appear in this book, but it's a documentation of the strategies that were used to try to meet the Soviet challenge in a nuclear age: mass terror, mass destruction. And I ask you, when you think of what an ISIS does or what the revanchist, regressive Putin thinks, and why the Chinese cannot reform themselves in a democratic direction without risking the solidity of the party. When one is a socialist, one is a bureaucrat. When one is a communist, one is a totalitarian bureaucrat. Neither of those systems can really reform. I was a bureaucrat from 1963 in the Kennedy administration, straight out of Harvard and Berkeley. I went there. I was considered a traitor in Berkeley for having joined the fascist government. But the bureaucracy in and of itself is terrible. It's terrible. The Office of the Secretary of Defense right now has several thousand people in it. The National Security Council staff, where I worked in the Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations, as a civil servant, 16 years, 4 presidents, is longer than anybody else that I know of, was a fairly tightly run system under Reagan. I think it was smaller than what Henry Kissinger had. And what he did with his vision and his team there in the White House, but also Cap Weinberger, Bill Casey, and less successfully Al Haig, more successfully George Shultz, was in fact to implement a strategy that he had come up with, not in 1980 or 81, but a bit earlier already. What he did in the 70s when he challenged President Ford and then backed out, but started running full blast between 76 and 80, was to prepare himself for the presidency. And while he was disliked by the media, by the establishment of the media, his own party, the academic world, the Congress, he was preparing. And he worked with a broad coalition, the Reagan coalition. And among its most strongest members were the Committee on the Present Danger, which was led by Democrats, Jackson Democrats, who had been pushed out of the party as the party moved left. And many of those people joined the government. Many of those people also joined the government also came from Team B, which was set up by George Bush and Ford, President Ford, in terms of looking at alternative ways, less benign than were looked at by the Carter administration, at the Soviet threat, their enormous asymmetric buildup, their proxy warfare in Africa. 40,000 Cubans were sent to Africa to fight wars there, in addition to what the Cubans were beginning to do in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador. And the Soviets were cheating in each of the agreements they had signed in the Détente period in 1972, the SALT agreements, the ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the principles of Détente. The Soviets had also cheated on the Vietnam Peace Accords, and we helped bring the communist victory by early abandonment of our allies. I was last in Vietnam. I was there on 9 different trips from the NSC. In '73, I was there 3 times. I could travel anywhere as an NSC official with just an interpreter. It was safe. But then we cut the ammunition in half, and the bombing was stopped by demand of the Congress. And that's why when I see what we did in Vietnam and in Afghanistan and more particularly in Iraq, it's so shameful, so shameful. So Reagan was determined not to have those kind of defeats. And he was also determined not to overstretch. So when 243 Marines were killed in Lebanon because they weren't adequately protected in the barracks, he pulled them out. On the other hand, when Libya undertook bombings and otherwise misbehaved, he struck at Gaddafi with air power. And when it counted in Central America, he brought in special forces and lots of economic help too, and especially also trying to defend allies that were under attack in the international forums where the Soviets and others were pushing against them. So Reagan, I think, did something that had not been attempted before in preparing a strategy based on people like the Committee on the Present Danger Analyses. He and Dick Allen traveled to Western Europe in the 70s and looked at the Conservative Party opposition that was then around, like Maggie Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and others. He formed friendships. And one of the first things he did when he became candidate was to use the platform that had been developed by him. I helped write the Foreign Policy and Defense section when I was working with John Tower, Senator Tower, who was in charge of the platform committee at the convention. I did all of this as a civil servant, by the way. There were waivers granted. I was never not a civil servant in the government. And we had a platform that went into great detail on every issue. And I can't explain all of it, but on Latin America, on arms control, on freedom, ideological combat, very strong, also fairly detailed programs. Arms control, for example, was put in the defense section. It was not in the diplomatic section. So when I was asked by Dick Allen to join the NSC from Tower's office, back where I'd worked with 3 other presidents, I said I'd wanted to work in the defense section and had my eyes set on doing the arms control part. When we did threat analyses that were part of the arms control concept, and when we rejected the nuclear freeze, some of us rejected it. Many, especially in the State Department and ACTA, liked it. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, ACTA. We looked at the record of what was actually going on from a defense, national security point of view. That was not how arms control had been conducted before. So that meant, among other things, that President Reagan insisted that the JCS had to certify, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had to certify the military appropriateness of what we were proposing. And the Arms Control Agency, to its chagrin, and the CIA joining in, had to certify that verification was not adequate, but was high confidence, which is a CIA standard. That's very different from adequate, which means elastic. You only depend on overhead, national technical means. You actually had to go on site. You actually had to have verification of the data. And so the first big arms control proposal, intermediate nuclear forces, was in 1981 for double zero options. Get the Soviets, who had deployed about 1,100 systems, warheads, on the SS-20 and the SS-4s and 5 missiles in Europe. We had deployed 0. The people who came up with that 0 option were told by, among other things, very senior State Department officials that this was not credible. You'll see in my book, where I have the notes of the NSC meetings, how that was rejected by people who really wanted the freeze or moratorium or lowest possible levels, but please not double zero. My argument, and the presidents certainly used that, was, wait, they have to go down more because they built more. We go to equal levels. If equal level is 0, then that's where we go. In the START Treaty, too, the same thing. We went to, had about a 1/2 cut in the missiles, 1/3 cut in the warheads. Those were arms reductions, not freezes that were violated, because we complied and the other guys didn't. So as you go up through 83, in the first 2 years, I believe President Reagan, having hit the ground running with his platform, with the new strategies and the final summation of a strategy in January 83, the NSDD 75, had a very clear battle to take down the Soviet ideology and system. These two things are related because when you're dealing with totalitarians, they need complete authority. If you challenge, if they make a mistake, if they're caught making a mistake or are hypocritical or have a contradiction in their ideology, that's ruinous because that myth is what they bind this society with, and terror. And if they don't have the authority to shoot the dissenters or imprison them, or they hesitate, they're going to lose it. They have to have that forward momentum, which is also why when the president sent people, American military, into Latin America to help the Contras, or to help in El Salvador, or when he sent Stingers to Afghanistan, which changed the monopoly, really, that the Soviets had in the air. It became very expensive for the Soviets. Or when he changed the technical transfer and hard currency regulations on the Soviets, who were being bailed out by us, by our technology. Their socialist economy, communist economy, with their 4- and 5-year plans wasn't doing it. And there was actually some hunger among the population for reform. They found out that they couldn't reform the system. When Gorbachev comes in 85, he writes his first book, Perestroika. Read it sometime. It's a totally Leninist book. It praises the total authority of Lenin. They're going to follow his model. Well, he tried to reform the party. He couldn't do it enough at all to reform the industry. to reform the planning system, to reduce the corruption that that party elite, as any communist, and I believe any socialist system evokes. It creates an elite. It creates a new class, as Gilas said in 1961 already. A new class, more powerful, more concentrated. If any of that authority is broken in terms of credibility or the authority to not use violence, when you have peaceful demonstrations getting out of hand, when you have an independent labor in Germany, which happened in East Germany till the November 9th, 89 breaking of the wall, when you have solidarity being independent in Poland, and the Polish government, in the weeks when Mr. Reagan came into power, had declared martial law and was cracking down, but they couldn't sustain it because not only was Reagan very loudly denouncing this and proposing sanctions, which were kind of objected to by the State Department, the Pope was doing the spiritual work, and he did it in '79 in his 9 days. And the Pope and Reagan shared one other thing. They'd both been assassinated. I mean, there had been assassination attempts, and they both survived. And that reinforced, I think, in both of them, the notion of divine providence and having to fulfill responsible missions. And so I'm speaking somewhat at random, but I'm trying, because I have too many things I would like to shape in your mind that you may not have
We're good until
heard.
12.
But I would like you to consider reading the book, and you will see that in each of these instruments of statecraft and analysis and follow-through, Reagan and a few people, relatively few people, enforced that vision. And he studied a lot. By the way, when we I staffed about 40 of his NSC meetings, and I briefed him, especially when Judge Clark was in charge, and I credit Judge Clark, his brother, with such an enormous role in sustaining what Dick Allen had started, and then what Bud McFarland, whom we're honored to have here, who's a very fine individual, tried to sustain against very great odds. Reagan was in total power, I would say, until about 83, 84. Then he got a huge boost on his wonderful election mandate in 84, which was used by the traditional diplomats to say, now you have to ease up on the poor Soviets, you know. And Gorbachev comes in 85 after that mandate. And what is Reagan? He's tougher than ever. Tougher than ever. I wrote negotiating instructions on his guidance to our negotiators, and they were not allowed to back off as some people wanted them to. They were made to go more strongly. We got stronger in our ideological combat and used this public diplomacy at the USIA to analyze what the Soviets were saying and doing everywhere. They were doing it. Wonderful stuff on what the Sandinistas were doing wrong or what the Cubans were doing wrong with human rights in Eastern Europe. And that public diplomacy, which also involved declassifying a lot of information about the Soviet military and intelligence work, unparalleled, never been repeated. Today we have nothing. There's nothing from the White House or anywhere else that tells you what ISIS really is about or what the Russians are really doing backwards or what the Chinese are really doing. No official documents. Read them in my book, and you will also find the exposure in the intelligence reforms that Reagan undertook. An extraordinary revelation about the fronts, active measures, deceptions, forgeries, bribes that the Soviets had as part of their totalitarian imperial behavior, which mirrored very closely their domestic behavior. I thank you for this opportunity to share some things with you. Thank you.
A terrific job, and I was watching Bud McFarland, and when he nodded several times, I knew you were saying the right thing. I really commend the book to you, and after our session, there'll be books also for sale and autographs at the end of tonight. Our next speaker is Craig Shirley. Many of you know him, and he's the author of 3 bestsellers on President Reagan. Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan and the Campaign That Changed America in 2009. Reagan's Revolution, the untold story of the campaign that started it all in 2005. And his current book, Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan, 2015. And some of you may know that Last Act was named the best narrative in the nonfiction category by USA Book News for 2015. Craig has been named the first scholar at Eureka College, President Reagan's alma mater, where he also has taught a course on Reagan 101. He's a member of the Board of Governors of the Reagan Ranch and a member of the Board of Trustees at Eureka College. And to pay for all this, he is a founder of Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs so that he can keep writing on Reagan, and we thank him for it. So please join me in welcoming Craig Shirley.
I'm so glad Lou didn't use the long version. It's starting to sound like my obituary. I'm almost tempted to suggest that I yield the balance of my time and just listen to Sven for the next half hour. I thought that was just marvelous. That was just terrific. Thank you so much. My book takes a little bit different tack. When I was working on my second Reagan book, Rendezvous with Destiny, I had worked out of the house most of the time, and binders of research from the Reagan Library and interviews and news clips and things like that, and no binders of women, though. And my son, who's standing here tonight, by the way, is Reagan, who's also a Reagan alumnus, and my son, whose middle name is Reagan, are here tonight. He was then 9, and he was going through these binders, and as I was standing in the kitchen smoking a cigarette and drinking a glass of wine and editing, and Zreen was editing, and he'd be going through the binders with a yellow highlighter, and every time Reagan's name popped up, he would highlight it. And one night he says to nobody in particular, he says, actually to me, he says, "Dad, has anybody ever done a book about Ronald Reagan after he was president?" And I thought for a moment, and I said, "No." And it immediately occurred to me that I had to write it for fear of Kitty Kelly or Bill O'Reilly writing it and totally screwing it up. So and there's been a lot of terrific scholarship associated with post-presidencies. Jim Bishop wrote FDR's Last Year, and Alan Pell Crawford wrote Twilight at Monticello. But there's never been a book written about Reagan's post-presidency, and I wanted to dispel the myth. You know, the myth is that he went back to California, announced he had Alzheimer's, and passed away. But as a matter of fact, he lived 16 years, and there was a lot of living in those 16 years, even after the Alzheimer's. There were world travels, and there were speeches and meetings with Gorbachev, and opening of presidential libraries, and salmon fishing, and whitewater rafting, and blimp rides, and you know, so there was a lot of living that went on, and I wanted people to understand that. I'm not going to speak too long. Ronald Reagan once said the definition of middle age is when you're faced with two temptations and you choose the one to get you home in bed by 9:30. I know we all want to be home in bed by 9:30 so we can see who wins New Hampshire. On the other hand is that being here, and by the way, Lou, let me echo Sven's comments. This is what you've done with this is just marvelous. We were talking earlier, you know, there isn't a Carter Alumni Association, you know, this is that, and I don't know about the Bush Alumni Association, but I know the Reagan Alumni Association is active and vital and contributing and ongoing, and I think that reflects both Lou's dedication and the love, and I'll say it, the love, the admiration we feel for this man that we all served so well. So as Mae West once said, she said, "Too much of a good thing is wonderful." And so this is too much of a good thing. You know, in the course of now I'm working, by the way, I'm working on a fourth Reagan book. And it's interesting that you talked about that period between 1976 and 1980, because now I'm going to have to interview Sven. I'm writing a fourth Reagan book called Becoming Reagan. And it's about that time between 1976 and 1980 when he goes through a complete ideological makeover. The Reagan of 1980 is completely unlike the Reagan of 1964. The Reagan of 1964, when he's speaking for Goldwater, is angry. He's angry at the Great Society. He's angry at Lyndon Johnson. He's angry at the Vietnam War. The Reagan of 1980 is what I would call a much more hopeful American conservative and much more, I think he quotes Emerson and Paine a lot more often, and I think he drives a lot of insight from the Enlightenment. I know some of my Catholic friends won't be happy to hear that, but I do think that he found his American conservative philosophy, which was based on the individual, which was based on the rights and the privacy and the dignity of the private individual, and that he believed in. And if you go back and look at his speeches as president, you'll see that he talks about the individual often, and he quotes Paine often, and he quotes Emerson often. So, but in the course of working on my books, I tried to interview a lot. In fact, I interviewed a lot of people in this room. But one person I wasn't able to interview for the book on the 80 campaign was Alice Cooper. And you say, well, you know, why would you want to interview a rock and roll star about Alice Cooper? And I said, well, it turns out Alice was a Reagan supporter. Alice remains a conservative today. Alice donated to the Reagan campaign in 1980, and Alice voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980. And so I wanted to get the perspective of why would a rock and roll star, be for Reagan. And so we reached his office in Phoenix, and I remember talking to his assistant and explaining what, and she interrupts me. She says, "Well, it'd be a waste of time." And I said, well, why? And I mean, it's just a couple questions about it. And she says, well, you have to understand that Alice was drunk from 1966 to 1983. And I said, you mean all the time? And she said, yeah, pretty much. So he wouldn't remember anything. On the other hand, is that when it comes to age, I'm realizing now that I too am playing on the back nine, that I went on the Jon Stewart show a couple years ago when I did another book called December 1941, which is about the 31 days that radically changed America forever. Between the 1st and the 31st of December 1941, we became forever internationalist country. We became forever more Washington-centric country. It just, in every way, shape, or form, it changes us culturally, attitudinally, economically, militarily, and anyway, I was going on the Jon Stewart show, and I wasn't all that familiar with Jon Stewart because I don't watch the Comedy Channel. I usually watch History Channel or whatever else, but my kids are, of course, know all about it. But so anyway, I'm doing the pre-interview with the producer for the Jon Stewart show, and her name was Jennifer. It seems like all producers, TV producers, are named Jennifer or Aaron. I don't know why, but so I'm doing this pre-interview with Jennifer, and she's grousing. She says, "I don't even know why I ask these questions because John just asks the questions he wants to." Anyway, and so finally, I say to her, I said, Jennifer, I got to tell you is that I think my kids are more excited about me going on The Daily Show than I am. And there's this long pause, and she says, "Mr. Shirley, we hear that a lot from men your age." History is all around us. John Carlyle said, "History is but the biography of great men." I agree with that, but I also disagree with it. I think history is in everybody, and especially people in this room, is that all of you knew, worked, communicated, talked, met with, rode in Air Force One, rode in limousines with Ronald Reagan and the key members of his government and his administration. I urge you, all of you, to write down your recollections. It's invaluable to history, and there are plenty of websites now where you can record your memories. There's no reason why not. It is, I can tell you, it's absolutely invaluable. Is that I had, when I was working on December 1941, I had to kind of eke out a meager existence trying to collect letters, that were written to parents from the boys in the Pacific and written from parents to their sons in the Pacific and things like that. But so I think that I don't think that history is just a biography of great men. It is a biography of great men, but it's also the history of all of us. So, and all of you here are here because you are a part of history. And I urge you, please, to write down any and all recollections. I was giving a talk at the Reagan Library, and I said the same thing. And this woman came up to me afterwards. She said, "Mr. Shirley, I have a bit of personal history." And I said, "Oh, what is it?" She said, "My father was on the USS Oklahoma in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Now, for those of you who don't remember, the USS Oklahoma was slammed by 2 Japanese torpedoes, capsized, although it didn't sink. Here he was, 19 years old, in a capsized battleship, obviously pitch black all around him, the smell of oil all around him, the smell of death all around him, the sounds of men screaming and dying all around him. Water is filling his compartment. He doesn't know if he's going to live. 19 years old. He's hanging there now for 24 hours on this metal bar, iron bar, and 24 hours later, he finally hears the sound of the acetylene torches cutting through the hull. But the whole time, he doesn't know whether it's Japanese coming to kill him or Americans coming to save him. So, and I said, you have to write this down. You have to write this down. As a matter of fact, she did. Another friend of mine, he's a former Marine Corps pilot in Vietnam, and then he flew many years for American Airlines, and now he flies his private plane in retirement, and I was out flying with him once, and we were talking about December 1941, and he says, well, my father was on the USS Nevada on December 7th, 1941. I said, okay, now you tell me. I've already published my book. And he says, yeah, he was on KP duty at 7 a.m. on the morning of December 7th, 1941. He was on KP duty. He's on deck peeling potatoes. And all of a sudden, these Japanese bombers and Zeros drop out of the sky, and he has nothing but potatoes in his hands. So as the airplanes are whizzing by, he's throwing potatoes at them, trying to do whatever damage he could. So that was his history. But again, it's still important, or at least it's funny, or at least it's ironic. The history of Ronald Reagan should not be left to liberals, as we've recently discovered, or those who have bad intent or malice. I would refer obviously to Sven and other people. Henry Now back there wrote a terrific book on Reagan anti-communism, foreign policy. Other people here have written terrific books. Is that I used to think that that everybody could write history if they came to it with good intentions. I no longer believe that. There's too many liberals who write with bad intentions. James McGregor Burns, who I regard as is not only a great historian but also a liberal, but liberalness was beside the point. He was a great biographer of Roosevelt, and he said he would rank Reagan in the great or near great category. John Patrick Diggins, another recently deceased historian, who in many ways was the official chronicler of the American left in the 20th century, wrote books about the American labor movement and American women's movement, but his last book was called Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. And in this book, he says that Ronald Reagan is this liberal professor says, Ronald Reagan is one of our 4 greatest presidents, because like Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, he freed or saved many, many people. But those are fortunately old school, so we're going to have to leave it. Unfortunately, that like everything else has become maybe too polarized, even American history and presidential history now. So, so all the more important why you have to record your memories, why you have to write them down, why you have to write your own books. I tried to in Last Act. Obviously, it's about the passing of Ronald Reagan, but it's also about the 16 years, and there were a lot of good stories in there too. There were a lot of funny stories in there. When he went back in January of 1989 back to California, he and Mrs. Reagan were supposed to take 6 months off and relax. You know, he was tired after 8 tumultuous years in Washington. And so they found a office. Fred Ryan found an office in Century City, you remember, and it was a high rise there, and it was not far from their new house in Pacific Palisades. But he called Fred after only a couple weeks at home. He says, "I'm coming in," and so they're all in dungarees and they got boxes, things like this. So they scramble to put together an office for former President Reagan. He comes in. "How you doing?" Shakes everybody's hand, goes into the office, shuts the door. You know, a couple hours later, he comes out and he hands Fred a piece of paper. And he says, "Fred, I'd like to meet with these people." And Fred looks at his list of 15, 20 people. And he says, doesn't see any names he recognizes. And Fred says, "Mr. President, who are these people?" And Reagan says, "Well, they've been calling." Well, it turned out that when the telephone operator, or the telephone repairman installed the phones, he cross-wired the installation. So the phones that were supposed to go to the receptionist went directly to Reagan's office. So the whole time the receptionist is sitting there twiddling her thumbs, these phones are going. Reagan, "Hi, this is Ronald Reagan. I want to come in and see you." You know, so but true to his word, every person was invited in to get their photograph taken with Ronald Reagan and meet President Reagan. There was one guy Fred called to schedule the appointment, and he said, "Oh boy, this is great. I'm gonna bring my neighbor." And Fred said, "Look, buddy, lightning struck here once. You're not gonna get a second bite at the apple." The second, more poignant. I don't know how much time I have, but
Take a few more.
okay,
Q&A.
that which I think speaks to your point, Sven, about his Christian faith, was that several months after the assassination attempt in March of 1981, and after he recovered, he called Daniel Ruge, Dr. Daniel Ruge, who was the White House physician, into his office, and he gave him a startling suggestion. He wanted to meet in private with John Hinckley to tell him that he forgave him. He didn't want to issue an official pardon. He didn't want to issue a presidential proclamation. He wanted to go to St. Elizabeth's and meet in private with John Hinckley and tell the young man he forgave him. Dr. Ruge said, "This is interesting, Mr. President. I will call Dr. Roger Peel, who's the head of the psychiatric unit at St. Elizabeth's Hospital." He calls him, and Dr. Peel says, "Look, this is most unusual. We've got 6 psychiatrists who are handling his case. I will ask them." Now, St. Elizabeth's at the time was going through the process of being transferred from the control by the district government to the federal government. It needed additional federal funding. A presidential visit would have arguably brought down a lot of extra money, on this cash-strapped institution. And yet, to a person, the 6 psychiatrists were asked, they said no. They said, "This is the most sociopathic patient we've ever had. He feels no pain, no remorse, no regret. He only feels his own pain. And if the president met with him, he would interpret it as somehow vindication for what he did instead of an act of Christian charity." So Reagan ended up not meeting with him, but it was the intent. He wasn't Catholic, but the intention was still good. I interviewed, and Dr. Peel was a wonderful, wonderful person, a great friend. We became great friends. But he told me later, in one of his phone conversations with Reagan, he said, "It seemed to me like Reagan was talking to me from the clouds," and he later found out that Reagan was calling him from Air Force One. I want to read, and I guess I had the people in this room in mind when I wrote this. It's about that time after the funeral at the National Cathedral, when a lot of us were filing out, so anyway, my brother once said, "It isn't the hair that goes first." The crowd filed out right after the ceremony, mostly silent, to the dour day and dozens of television cameras. But there was also a fair amount of handshaking and air kissing and networking and gawking. Henry Kissinger was in big demand by the camera crews, and he gladly complied with every interview request. It was clear who was there to mourn Reagan and who was there to celebrate Washington society. In contrast to Kissinger, when a reporter asked Bill Buckley for an interview, he said, "No, I won't." Among the Reaganites, it was different. They knew each other almost by instinct. From Sacramento, from the campaigns, from the White House to the offices of Century City to the library. The rest of the post-presidency, they gathered in small clutches, touching, hugging, kissing, crying, many somber and sad. For them, it just wasn't that a president had died. It wasn't just that a monumentally successful president had died. It wasn't just that a man of stunningly high character and goodwill had died. For the Reaganites, it was something deeper. For the Reaganites, it was more personal. They had their own treasured stories of Reagan and Mrs. Reagan, stories of speeches and events and meetings, of conversations and picnics and meals, of policies and jokes and tragedies and fights and primaries and elections. They went on and on. It was rarely one-upsmanship either. Sure, some complained about Jim Baker or Dick Darman or an errant cabinet member, but more often than not, they celebrated each other. They treasured and respected their other stories and experience of the cause of working for Ronald Reagan, the cause of saving Western civilization, the cause of American intellectual conservatism. Though some may have experienced difficulty explaining it, they all understood it easily. They all believed in it, and they knew that Reagan believed in it too. His passing was the passing of an era. He was their friend, their inspiration, their hero, their rock. They were Reaganites, had been Reaganites, and would always be Reaganites. They were proud of this and knew others were envious. Their obituaries would say they had worked for Reagan, and each was proud to have had that honor. Their lives had been defined by the Gipper, and their pride abounded. That was just as, like I said. I want to close here. There was three things to remember about Ronald Reagan is that I think sometimes we almost over-intellectualized him, is that we forget that this was a man who was a lot of fun. This was a man who loved a good joke. You know, Margaret Thatcher said in her eulogy, she said that he brought the great cause of fun back to society, back to humanity, and what is life without enjoying it? And I think that sometimes is lost on us when we go too far to over-intellectualize him. You know, once in the 1960s when he was governor, he was confronted by a rather smelly, odorous, dirty, disheveled hippie. Maybe it was Bill Clinton. But the dirty, disheveled, smelly hippie was carrying a sign, and the sign said, "Make love, not war." And Reagan looked at the sign, he looked at the hippie, he turned to an aide, and he says, "You know, from the looks of him, I don't think he could do either." In 1980, he was to give a speech to the American Legion in the fall of 1980. And you've heard a different version of this story, but you haven't heard this story. As you remember, in 1980, we had lost the Vietnam War. And we lost the Vietnam War because the Pentagon was corrupt, because it was not a war of ideology, it was a civil war, and that the American protester was right, and the American military and the American will and the cause of anti-communism were wrong. And that was the predominant, prevailing, accepted wisdom. And anybody who defended the Vietnam War or the intention of the Vietnam War was a fool. Reagan didn't believe that. He wanted to give a speech to the American Legion. He wanted to call the Vietnam War a noble cause. And his staff says, "Mr. Governor, you can't say that." And he says, "Well, I want to say it." So he put it in the draft. They took it out. He put it in the draft a second time. They took it out. He put it in a draft the third time, and they took it out. And yet, when he gave that speech in Boston, the American Legion, he called Vietnam a noble cause. And 10,000 American Legionnaires stood and applauded him. And the American people stood and applauded him. The elites and the columnists and the liberals all came down with the vapors. They all, "Oh my God, he called it a noble cause, how dare he?" But Reagan believed that 58,000 young boys did not die in vain in Vietnam. and he was going to say what was on his mind, regardless of what his staff said and what the elite said. I've spoken long enough, so let me just close by saying that in Jackie Gleason's old restaurant in Los Angeles, there was a sign over the bar which said, "We know now there's no fountain of youth, so the next best thing is the company of good friends." So thank you, my good friends. Thank you.
We've approached 8 o'clock, but we could take a couple of questions if you have some. A quiet crowd. Henry?
Sven and Greg, thank you very, very much for a wonderful, wonderful evening. One of the things we desperately need today in this country is unity among the conservatives and unity among the people of the country. What do you think was the secret to Reagan's capacity? What was the most important feature that he brought to the scene that enabled him to unite us in a way that I haven't seen since that time?
Well, there's a parallel to the current situation in the Democratic Party, which is that Reagan inherited the people who had been pushed out of the Democratic Party in the McGovern Revolution that pushed Hubert Humphrey aside and all traditional liberals and turned far left. I saw that happen at my campus in Berkeley, where a coalition turned into far left Fair Play for Cuba committee group, and that pushed other people more into the center. So the Committee on the Present Danger was bipartisan. Heritage was bipartisan. By the way, I co-wrote the defense chapter in the mandate with Ty McCoy, and one other thing Heritage did was work on a plum book, so that Ed Meese was given that when, by chance, the Republicans won. Probably wouldn't have been given to the Democrats, I don't know. But, and so the staffing of that administration shared from a lot of previous thoughts. But, so I think that the national crisis that we can see at the domestic level, but I don't work on economics and stuff, but it's there. The international crisis certainly should drive a large core of the American people to follow somebody who believes that he must provide or she must provide for the common defense and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That means not tactics, that means strategy. And by the way, if you don't do those two constitutional imperatives, you cannot create a more perfect union. You cannot establish justice. You cannot assure domestic tranquility. You cannot promote the general welfare. Go to Afghanistan or go to Syria today and find out what happens when you don't provide for the common defense and secure the blessings of liberty. So that is a rallying call. Freedom is a rallying call. Freedom domestically against bureaucracy, freedom internationally against terrorism and totalitarianism. I would like to add a few minutes, just very few, to my presentation before, because I left out many, many things, but there are two or three.
They're not going to buy your book if you tell them everything.
Ronald Reagan knew the history of the Second World War, including the Hitler-Stalin Pact in Munich. He referred to Munich in my presence certainly several times. He knew that Hitler and Stalin had a pact, National Socialism and Communism, for 21 months. Stalin was on the wrong side, cheering while Hitler went into Netherlands and France and was attacking Britain and took Norway and Denmark. He was on the wrong side. He didn't switch sides till he was invaded. And then we, with our Lend-Lease aid, massive, it's documented in the book, and our fighting on multiple fronts of the Second World War where the Soviets were absent, North Africa, Normandy, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Burma, China. We saved China. We saved a lot of the world. Did the Russians? The Russians had a neutrality pact with Japan and did nothing until the last days, basically after we had dropped an atomic bomb and the war was over. So Reagan knew some of that history. He also knew what happened at Yalta. He referred to Yalta, certainly in my presence several times and in speeches. He knew about the Berlin blockade. He knew about Korea. He knew about the rejection during the Eisenhower period of peace proposals and earlier the Marshall Plan by the Soviets. He knew that. He knew the uprisings in Poland and Hungary and East Germany. He knew what was wrong with that bizarre system, as he called it. And in his first big speech at Notre Dame, in March of 1981, he laid out the whole thing about totalitarian communism. And did the State Department or others like him when he said evil empire in March of 1983? Of course not. Did they like it when he said tear down this wall? Of course not. And those of us that, I worked with Tony Dolan, the speechwriter, and others, because I would stay very late in the NSC. I came in late and I stayed late. And so I was often the only action officer around, and the secretariat would call me, can you clear this cable? So I was clearing all kinds of stuff, and people were waiting for me to ask for clearance. Same with negotiation instructions and stuff. So Reagan stood up. He knew, but he knew what he was talking about. And he knew it from the heart and from his moral center, which was Judeo-Christian and transcendental. It was not tactical only at all, the way so much of our current politics is. And he spoke of spiritual combat and strength, and he was resilient. And he, in the NSC meetings, and I am proud that I found these declassified things, recently declassified, where the tension, whether it's Poland or technology or Contras, where he was really up against people who want to cave in. He is resilient. He is there. I don't know whether such a person can make it in our political system today, but there, I myself, already at that time believed in divine providence, making this person come in, but he did so much more beautifully than his rivals, Baker, Dole, George Bush the dad, and the right person won, and he beat a man who was an incumbent. Carter was expected until, I think, September to win the election in November. Reagan was not at all expected to win the nomination. But he worked for it. He knew what he was doing. He studied his history. He read articles. He knew all this press. He knew all the conservative press, and whether it was Human Events or National Review. And he read newspapers, and he and people like Ed Meese and Nick Allen turned to places like Heritage, Committee on the Present Danger, National Strategy Information Center, Commentary Magazine, and so on. That was a whole AI, a whole body of catalysts for the Reagan Revolution and for the Reagan Coalition. And that's what did it. So that's a long answer to your question.
Henry, to answer your question, I'll keep mine probably shorter than Sven's. Reagan spoke differently to the American people than any other Republican they'd ever been familiar with. And I believe that's because of his father. You know, there's been a lot of scholarship attached to his relationship to Mother Nell and being raised in the Disciples of Christ Church. But his father was Catholic. And Reagan didn't use the Protestant I, he used the Catholic we when he talked. And I think his father gave him a parish perspective. So when he talked to the American people, he said we, us, and ours instead of me, my, and mine. Unlike our current president. During the 1980 campaign, the Washington Post assembled a focus group of Republicans and Democrats and discovered an astonishing fact. Reagan's commercials, which were just him talking to the camera, were more popular with the Democrats than they were with the Republicans. So that's how he unified America, because he basically talked to everybody. He had a set core, he had a set of principles, but he talked to everybody. And of course, we know that was the creation of the Reagan Democrat, where in 1980 he got something like 25% of all Democratic voters nationwide. In Pennsylvania, he got 1 out of every 3 Democratic voters. But that was the beginning of the Reagan Democrat and the beginning of new political coalition. So that was how he achieved unity. He didn't, and just one other thing is that he didn't have much use for consultants. He would listen to Wirthlin, brief him on polling, but nobody ever said, John Sears tried to say to him one time that on abortion, he said, well, Governor, that can be your private opinion. And Reagan became enraged. He was not going to be muted or quelled or kept from saying what was on his mind, to the point where he and Sears, over Ed Meese, almost came to blows, and Sears had to be taken out of the room because Charlie Black and Jim Lake were afraid that Reagan was going to punch out John Sears.
Well, everyone, please join me in thanking our two speakers and Heritage.
We're adjourned.